you know, the Arab Spring has fastly moved into a hot summer, and the hot summer, without any transitioning through fall, moved into a bitter winter. We are now living into the bitter winter of the Arab Spring. And it's important to keep in mind certain generalities before going into the specificities. And the first generality that probably most people who are not historians of the Arab world will probably not readily see is that the Arab world has been in a revolutionary fervor since the end of World War I. I wrote a book in 1973 called The Arab Revolution, and Arnold Toynbee was gracious enough to write the foreword to it. We were both together at Stanford University teaching at the time. I was a very, very modest young man, and he, of course, was an extraordinary luminary. But I had latched on to this idea that the Arab world was truly going through a very deep-rooted revolution. And in one of the sentences in the foreword, in my introduction to the book, I said, if Israel didn't exist at all, the Arab world would still be in torment and turmoil, because what is happening in the Arab world has nothing to do with this particular factor, which may be, like other aggravating factors, a factor, but it is not the central factor. The Arab world, if you have to look at its history, has been integrated into the Islamic nation as early as about 636, 637 for Palestine, what is now Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, 642 Egypt. By 646, it was all of North Africa. By 650, it was Mesopotamia. And then from that point on, the Arab identities, please emphasize that, of each and every Arab countries were subsumed in the Islamic identity. But as the Islamic world and its history changed, and the Muslim Ummah converted into a Muslim empire, and the empire in turn broke down into multiple different Muslim regimes, so did the Arab world go through these transformations and convulsions without ever gaining its identity. Come the Turkish Ottoman Empire, and for almost until the 15th century, in the 15th century, until the end of World War I, the Turkish Ottoman Empire dominates. During World War I, you have the beginning of the boiling of the Arab Revolution manifesting itself into Arab nationalism. And the sense of Arab nationalism which emerges is a very nationalistic sense. And you can see a vast difference between the sort of pro-intellectual French influence of the Syrian Lebanese elite in the early 1920s, as opposed to the Egyptian anti-colonial, anti-British movement, and different other manifestations of Arab nationalism arising. The movement results in a number of conflicts and finally obtaining of the independence of these countries, each one of these countries seeking its identity, only to discover that it had traded off the rulers of the Turkish Ottoman Empire to local dictators, local Ottomans, so to speak of. And from there, it moved away from colonialism, only to find itself under the colonial empire of monarchies or military regimes or others. And then in the 50s comes out the idea of Arab nationalism, and you sort of a union that links a sense of Arabism and Islamism together, tied in with a portion of a new ideology, which at the time was a mixture of socialism and Marxism, that arises together. That movement rises once again to find itself fighting the new neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism, and its remnants represented by the different tyrannical monarchies and military dictatorship that existed. Now that, in a sense, ended with the defeat of Egypt in 1967. The limited military victory of Egypt in 1973 was not an Arab manifestation. It was exclusively an Egyptian manifestation. It remained limited to that. Egypt moved in the direction of Camp David. The rest of the Arab world didn't really follow. From 78 on, Egypt was the only country, for all practical purposes, to have moved in the direction of peace with Israel. 79 comes the peace treaty with Israel. It was not until 1993 that Jordan follows with its peace treaty. Israel is still not part of the region that it is part of geographically, probably for two reasons. One, the Arab world rejects it, and two, I think the Israelis have never really opted for being part of that region. Instead, they see themselves more as an extension of the West. In the midst of that turmoil, the sense of Arab nationalism, the sense of something of a conceptual idea that ties the Arabs together, sort of breaks apart. The Nasserite idea of Arab socialism, Arab nationalism, quickly disappears. Local nationalism remains, but it remains more in a sentimental type of nature. It is at that point that you have to look at the different revolutionary movements, as I would call them, in each and every Arab country. This time, it's quite possible that the Islamists will find a way of communicating within all of these countries so that the next revolutionary wave will not be on a country-by-country basis. It will be a revolutionary wave that will be spurred by the Islamist movements and that will have connections between them, and thus much more serious impact geopolitically in the region, and from there possibly in the Gulf, with increased geopolitical considerations, particularly for the United States, with, of course, the big role of Iran to be played in the picture. So, transitional justice in all of these countries in which you have had a prior accumulation of violations which required some type of transitional justice, no matter what the mechanism is it a truth commission or other, is non-existent. May I say that also in all of that discourse, the one thing that I find rather, what should I say, I want to use the word deplorable of not hearing, is victims' rights. Nobody speaks of victims' rights, and that's what it's all about. And unless we start putting the victim at the heart of whatever initiative we want to take, it's not going to be enough for us to say, well, let's try to prosecute. But prosecution is only a small part of it, and it cannot be the primary part. Prosecutions do not write the record of history. They do not right the wrongs of those who have been victimized.